G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 fantasy video. Today we're going through my race week preview and final thoughts ahead of the first race of the season in Bahrain. So if you're new around here or you're an existing viewer but are yet to subscribe to the channel, be sure to do so because there's going to be so much of this fantasy content throughout the F1 season. So for those of you that have not watched my final thoughts and race week preview video, typically I'll go through all the major talking points that have been covered in the lead up to the race, and in most videos also review potential chip strategies ahead of the weekend for your F1 fantasy teams. Given it is the first race of the season, I would ordinarily advise against using any chips. There are going to be several optimal times throughout the season to utilize all 6 of those chips you've got in your pocket. So I would avoid using them at the first race week where we know very little about the teams, the drivers, and the performance of the cars, and wait until we've got a few sprint races coming up or other races where there are more optimal opportunities to deploy those chips. So we'll cover off the key talking points before we revisit how my team is shaping up ahead of the weekend. In a nutshell, if you didn't already know, you've been living under a rock. Red Bull is going to be the best team, the team to beat, and the quickest out of the gates. From what we saw in testing, the new concepts that Adrian Newey, he's got a wind tunnel that lives up in his brain, has developed. It is really powerful, this car. It looks just as, if not even stronger than last season's RB19. And it's Max Verstappen's championship to lose. So I have every expectation he's going to be raring to go in the first race week of the season. I think Checo as well. He's got some really good early season form in the last few years, so I fully expect he'll also be looking to jump back onto the podium after a pretty rotten second half of last season. Going back to Max, there's been a bit of talk for those of you that have followed me along on Twitter as well, that Max is a potential non-factor in some teams because of his premium price tag. I think for me, I'm still leaning towards including Max in my team, but I think in terms of his performance, he's truly had, as we all know, one of the most dominant F1 fantasy seasons on record. He had 19 wins last year, 12 pole positions, a bunch of fastest laps, and a podium in all but one race in 2023. In addition to that, in terms of fantasy, he was the highest scoring fantasy driver in 21 out of 22 races last season. The next closest, Sergio Perez, with only 7 top 2 point scoring finishes in terms of fantasy. So sure, I can see why there is a bit of appeal for a non-max build, given Perez is, say, 10 million less. But his reliability, his consistency is unmatched by the rest of the grid. I'm very much open to the idea of exploring no Max in my team, but right now I can't go past the Dutchman. He is truly the best driver, or one of the best drivers in the best car on the grid. So I'm not going to, at this point in time, move away from him until I see a more viable alternative on the scene. On the topic of Sergio Perez, I mentioned his early season form in the last few seasons. To recap what I have pointed out on Twitter so far this week, in the last 3 seasons, he's finished in the top 5 in 7 of the first 8 races of the season. 2021, he had 7 top 5 finishes, which included 1 win and 1 P3 result. 2022, he had another 7 top 5 finishes in his first 8. The only race he didn't finish in the top 5 was a DNF. But in those 7 races, he did finish in the top 5. That included 1 win and 4 P2s. And then in 2023... 7 of his top 5 finishes in the first 8 races included 2 wins, both in Saudi Arabia and Baku, and then a further 2 P2s. So he's got some really impressive early season form. It appears to me as though as Red Bull develop the car and bring more upgrades, it seems as though that seems to suit Max's driving style. So I think the time to get Sergio Perez into your team is probably earlier in the season. That doesn't necessarily mean you only have to go with Sergio Perez. You could also go for the Red Bull constructor instead. But notwithstanding that, Red Bull are a weapon of a team, an absolute rocket ship compared to just about any other car on the grid. And for me, very much want to have some of that coverage heading into Bahrain. In terms of Ferrari, they are, in my opinion, Red Bull's closest rival. We saw a lot of promise from them in pre-season. So Carlos Sainz, Charles Leclerc both look really good. I think this SF24 is a step forward from last year's car. They were 1.4 seconds faster in their simulations than their 2023 Bahrain GP times. And I think they are going to be a force to be reckoned with, both on a single lap, which works in favour of Charles, given he's a historically very good qualifier, and over the course of an entire race. So really exciting for Ferrari. As a Ferrari fan myself, I've gone through enough heartbreak over the last few years supporting them. So I fully expect they're going to start off the season strong. And don't forget that 1-2 finish they had in Bahrain in 2022. I wouldn't say that's going to be an absolute lock this time around, but I certainly think they are in with a good shout for a podium. In terms of the other teams making up the top, Mercedes and McLaren, they were two teams I was not really so sure about. Not in terms of the kind of car they're delivering this year, but just because they were very much reserved. They stuck to their testing programs. They didn't really show too much of their hand through those 3 days last week. So I'm not sure what to expect. I'm not going to say they're going to be by any means in the midfield, but they could surprise us. They may not. There's been speculation that Mercedes race pace is going to be right up there. Their simulations look really good. And I also think that it's a much better baseline of a car than we had 12 months ago for the Silver Arrows. So really good sign for them. McLaren, again, great development in the second half of the year. They just aren't really on the fantasy radar at the moment because of their slightly dearer price tag. But again, I think that's going to change as the season moves on and the prices for some of these drivers and constructors start to normalize. For Alpine, there's been a lot of talk that they're going to struggle in the first few races of the year. Earlier today, this is a Tuesday night, there was a report that Alpine, as much as they were expected to not do so well in Bahrain, they may struggle even more than we anticipated. There's been a lack of aerodynamic performance that they weren't even expecting this early in the season. Excess weight, which surprises me given how much carbon fiber on that tractor they pushed out in their livery launch revealed. And then poor tyre management. We all know from Ferrari and Haas last year, who had such bad tyre degradation that they seem to look all right in qualifying and then just regress over the entire race distance. So that could really affect Alpine's race pace as well. So I think that really lessens the appeal of Gasly and Ocon to feature in the points and come across as solid fantasy assets, which, I mean, again, practice will probably show us a lot, but at the moment, it's giving me cold feet for now. So I think I'll quickly revisit my team once again in these videos. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time because I covered a lot of different options in my team selection video that went out earlier this week. But this was probably where my head was at about 72 hours ago over the weekend following testing. As I mentioned before, Alpine have probably got me feeling a little concerned for those drivers in Gasly and Ocon. I think as the season wears on, I think a works team like Alpine is going to catch up a little bit in the midfield. But you know, if they're really well off the pace, they're fighting it out with Haas. It's not really a team that I want in and around my fantasy lineup. So I have this team at the moment, but a solid alternative I'm looking at is a Lance Stroll, Valtteri Bottas combination. I think there's a little bit for Aston Martin. I wouldn't to be interested in. I wouldn't say they are suddenly going to be among the top 4 teams, but I also think they're ahead of RB as probably the next best team. So for me, Lance Stroll is an interesting one. The bloke honestly probably drives better with 2 broken wrists than he does with normal wrists after his drive in Bahrain last year, which ended up P6, I think. So let's see if he can do something decent in practice this Thursday and Friday. To pair him, it would probably be one of the Sauber teams. And I think the drivers, and I think the reason why I like Valtteri Bottas and Joe, I think they're equally good options, is just because if Alpine are going to struggle as much as they are, what's the point of forking out an extra 1.4, 1.2 million for essentially the same result? Again, I'm making a lot of presumptions here that Alpine are going to be as slow, if not slower, than Sauber. But right now, I can't see why Valtteri Bottas would be a bad option, and to pair with Lance Stroll probably works out all right for me. But I think, 0.5 in the bank gives you flexibility to pivot between both of these guys at the minute. In saying that, though, the one thing I will flag is that F1FantasyTools.com, the best F1 fantasy resource out there for strategists like you and I, have forecast projected a number of different fantasy builds, particularly the top scoring ones this race weekend. And most interestingly, over on their simulations, I've got the 2 times as Max Verstappen. The best thing about this team calculator functionality is that you can choose drivers that you want to include or exclude from possible team builds. So for me, I'm pretty certain on having Max in my team. So all I need to do is go down and select this box here, and it will recalculate all the team builds that include Max Verstappen. Now, another team build I entertained earlier in the week was a Ferrari-Mercedes combination. And surprise, surprise, that's who is at the top of the charts for the 2 premium constructor options. That projects 200 points for this week and mirrors a pretty similar lineup to what I have here in terms of the drivers, I mean to say. The one thing I will say, though, about this is that the notes they've disclosed here, 40% is based on 2023 data, 60% on F1 preseason. I personally think Daniel Ricciardo probably is undersold a little bit. And the reason why I say that is because he captures part of Nick de Vries's performance through 2023. So I am probably leaning to having Daniel Ricciardo. But for argument's sake, if we were to just peel back the rest of the team to its bare bones, Albon, I think, for me, is almost certainly a lock in my team. That leaves us with 23.6. And the rest of the team that I would ultimately fill out would be an RB duo and someone like Valtteri Bottas or Joe. I really like the RBs. I think there's a lot of upside, not just for points, but also for the price increases. Typically, we saw last season a lot of medium to lower price drivers see more drastic price increases when they were featuring in the points a lot. Yuki Tsunoda had some incredible price rises to close out the last season, given his pretty impressive drives between, I think it was Singapore. If we check here, I can tell you that right now, between Qatar and Abu Dhabi. So, that kind of double-digit performance from a driver priced under $10 million, if he can replicate that, it's pretty stunning if you ask me. And I think in a much improved car that has adopted components from the RB19, I'm not saying it's a mirror image of what we saw in last year's championship-winning car, but still something that is incorporating elements that proved very successful in the RB19. I fully expect that's going to hopefully reap some benefits for the RB outfit. I think something to be said for Ferrari Mercedes, and again, I'm rehashing a lot of what I said earlier in the week, is that you're obviously going without a double up on Max Verstappen without them as the constructor. And I think largely also hinges on Sergio Perez not doing so well, contrary to what I said before around his early season form. But if Mercedes and Ferrari are expected to be close to the top 5 or in the top 5, then I think this can certainly offset Red Bull as the constructor. I really like this build. It's very well balanced. Obviously, Valtteri Bottas also, I think, is an equally good replacement for any of the Alpine drivers. And if we're going up to their team calculator, I'll quickly do the same thing for Mercedes and Ferrari. Again, I'm not so sure 4.6 points per race for Ricciardo is accurate, but nor do I think 4 for Albon is accurate. But why don't we lob that lineup in? Again, Bottas, one of the lower ones. But let's see what that strips out for us. 194. I think that's not so bad. I was expecting it to probably be a little worse. But that's only, 5-6 points off the 200 odd we had for Max Verstappen earlier. So in the most optimal build. So 196 versus 200, it's negligible at this point. I'm pretty comfortable with what this lineup looks like as well. So I think at this point in time, leaning towards either this team or the Red Bull, RB, Verstappen, Ricciardo, Stroll, Bottas, Albon build. So very, very similar. It would only really be 1, 2, 3 out versus 1, 2, 3 in, or something like that. So yeah, a few different options to go off, but that's kind of where my head's at the moment. in terms of content between when you watch this video and the qualifying deadline, which is on Friday. I'm on the East Coast of the United States, so Friday morning, probably Friday afternoon for you folks in Europe, and further ahead for anyone else in Asia and Australia. Just be mindful of that. It's not a typical Saturday qualifying deadline, so be sure to lock your teams in as soon as practice finishes. I also do a 1 hour stream before qualifying, a deadline stream over on FanAmp every single race week with F1 Fantasy HQ. All the details for FanAmp, their channel, is in the description below, but we use this opportunity an hour before the deadline to answer any of your final burning questions, address team selection dilemmas in the live chat, and there's also giveaways from our show sponsor, Fifth Gear Garms. So be sure to enter the contest. All of the details, again, are going to be in the description below, and we will provide them during the race, the live stream for the race. But that I hopefully will be a time where I'm able to divulge my final team selection along with Adam from F1 Fantasy HQ, an awesome co-host, and someone you should also check out on Twitter and his website if you haven't done so already. But I will leave it there for now, guys. Be sure to drop by for the stream on Friday. I appreciate you watching. Good luck with your teams, and I'll see you all very soon.